So, we're going to talk more about fairies, and we're actually going to be talking about a book in particular and some older ideas versus modern ideas kind of thing that I have been working around over the last few years. This is also part of reconnecting with Fae, which, if you saw my last video, you know I'm working on. But one of the things I started doing was rereading some books, and there was a new book that came out, Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Faeries. This is fiction, okay? This is a fiction book, but it has some really great stuff in here. In an interview with Heather Fawcett, who wrote this book, she had mentioned that she writes young adult fairy stories and stuff like that too. Well, she has Catherine Brigg's Encyclopedia of Faeries. And one of the interviews, the reason why this book came about was because she was going through Catherine Brigg's Encyclopedia of Faeries. And if you are a Fae person like me, you know that is one of the go-tos. I don't own that book yet. It is on my list, my wish list. I really, really want that book, but it's one I don't have. However, Heather Fawcett has it and uses it as part of her folklore, as, research. And so she used that as her guide, basically. She said that in the interview that she was curious what it would take to do that kind of a guide. Like what would that character have to go through in order to create an encyclopedia of fairy? Hence, Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Faeries. I've read this book once. I'm currently right here on the research rereading, okay? The first read through, I read it for the story. I didn't know how I was going to feel about it. I didn't know, if it was just pure fiction or what I was going to feel. But as I got to the end of it, I was pleasantly surprised. It is a unique book, very, very unique, with a lot of more modern ideas, I would say. Even though it's set back in like 1909, it's got some historical stuff in it, like historic fiction type stuff. But the reality is, there are some historical facts in it that probably aren't quite right. But this is like like being on a different plane, actually. It's not set in our modern world, in our 1909. It takes aspects of 1909 from our history and then applies it to a fictional world of 1909 where fairies existed back then, and people did these huge research projects and people saw them all the time and interacted with them. And she, Emily, is doing a whole encyclopedia of it. And this is set up like journal entries, in her encyclopedia, which I thought was really, really cool. There's a lot of fairy interaction in here. There's a lot of aspects in this book where Emily got herself into some things, and I was like, what? Not because it was a surprise, but because of how it was written. It's written very, for lack of a better term, Fae. Emily is kind of disastrous. She's very chaotic, okay? And I think that when we read modern ideas of fairy, we are reinvigorating Fae inspiration, Fae belief, stuff like that. Like, that's one of the things that I don't feel like we should hold ourselves back on, is moving forward. And you don't think the Fae move forward? You don't think they give people inspiration to show them in something different, some new way, some strangeness, because they like stories. Like, that's one of the things they even talk about in here. Stories are huge to the fairy. And, they live vicariously through different means, right? Including themselves. They may not understand humans, but they toy with humans, they interact with humans, they help humans. There's all sorts of different things. They're mischievous, they steal things, they do all sorts of stuff, right? And some of them are even worse. Some of them, are stealing babies, or, stealing people, or all these other things, right? But the whole idea is that something doesn't just stay the same. You can read all the old books, which is fantastic and a great starting point, but it shouldn't stop there. That's my thing. It shouldn't stop there. Does that make it absolutely right for everybody? Absolutely not. But it is right for my spirituality and how I view the Fae. So I'm going to put that on my channel because that's how I feel about it. That's what I believe. That's what I'm working with. So I am doing a reread of this book, and it is looking more at the different stuff that's Fae related, like her first fairy interaction and how it went. And honestly, this book gives a lot more information than you would think. Honestly, there's a lot more in here than I would have even considered. Like fairy introductions, like how to introduce yourself to a fairy. It's one way of introducing yourself to a fairy. Like blew my mind. I was like, oh, why didn't I think of that? And like some of those kinds of things. So if you haven't read this book, I would suggest reading it if you're interested in fae. If you're interested in fairy fiction, it is a fun read. It is an interesting read. It's got a little tiny bit of light romance in it between the two main characters, and it's unique. Very slow going romance because Miss Emily is very oblivious to a lot of things. And I have theories about that too on the, fun reading scale. But also it has its own, it's like its own folktale, dude. It's like its own fairy everything. I don't even know how to explain it. It's very enchanting. It's very charming. The way that it's written has like, when you read old fairy stories, it's kind of written in that same kind of tone. And I like that. I really, really like that. So once I get through doing my more research aspects of this book, I will share that with you. But just in case you haven't picked this up or you don't know about it or you are curious about a fairy book that I might suggest, this is one I would suggest. It's a fun read. It's not very big. It's got some heavier stuff in it, right? It starts out a little light, but then towards the end it gets a little bit darker. And I think that falls in that in-between stage of fairies have both light and dark in them and stuff like that. And Poe, the cutest fairy ever, okay? The cutest fairy ever. When you meet Poe, you will love Poe. I love Poe. All right, so yeah, if you have read this, I would be very curious about your thoughts in the comments, and I will talk to you all later. Have a very great day.